Sarah Taylor slowly stepped into Thornfield Hall, an old mansion that had been abandoned for decades. Dense branches covered the entrance, creating a suffocating atmosphere, and the heavy wooden door creaked ominously as she gently pushed it open. The rain poured down outside, the sound of it beating heavily on the roof only emphasizing the solitude inside. Sarah stood in the middle of the vast foyer, where the cracked walls covered in moss seemed to tell the story of a once glorious past. The dim light from the oil lamp in her hand flickered weakly, not strong enough to fully reveal everything around her, but just enough for her to realize she was standing in an unusual place. The cold house felt as if it harbored something invisible, something dark that she couldn't see with her eyes. From afar, the wind howled through the broken windows, creating a rustling sound like the whispers of ghosts. Sarah felt a chilling gust run down her spine, even though the flame from the oil lamp still burned brightly. She gripped the lamp tightly, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "It's just my imagination," she whispered to herself, but the feeling of unease continued to grow inside her. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the floor above. It was the sound of footsteps, soft leather shoes gently tapping on the old wooden floor, steady but unhurried. Sarah froze, her eyes widening. Her heart began to race, and for the first few moments, she couldn't move. There couldn't be anyone here. This house had been abandoned for years. No one lived here. Sarah forced herself to stay calm, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. She took a step back, trying to distance herself from the strange sound. The footsteps continued, growing closer and closer. Each step seemed to pound directly into her mind, making it impossible to think clearly. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling, but only the echo of her own voice replied. Sarah tried to raise the lamp higher, hoping to cast more light into the darkness. But the weak flame only served to deepen the shadows surrounding her. The footsteps stopped. An absolute silence enveloped the house, but the air felt even heavier. Sarah stood still, not daring to move, sensing something lurking in the darkness, waiting for her. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind came from nowhere, extinguishing the lamp in her hand. Everything plunged into total darkness. She panicked, her heart seemingly stopping in her chest. For a brief moment, she felt a faint breath against the back of her neck. When Sarah turned her head, her eyes locked onto a pale figure at the end of the hallway. A woman in a white dress stood motionless, her head hanging low, long hair falling over her face, hiding her features. Sarah couldn't see the woman's face clearly, but her trembling shoulders and frail body radiated an overwhelming sense of sorrow. Sarah stood frozen, unable to utter a single word. In an instant, the woman lifted her head, revealing empty, black eyes so deep that Sarah felt as though she were being swallowed whole. Before she could react, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving only the icy chill that crept through Sarah's body. She jolted backward, her legs trembling. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt like it was being squeezed tight, trapping the sound inside. Cold sweat dripped down her forehead as Sarah fought to shake off the overwhelming terror. Her legs felt like they were glued to the floor, refusing to move. Questions raced through her mind. Who was that woman? What did she want? Was this just a hallucination, or a warning of something far worse? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed again, this time from behind her. Before she could turn around, a door in the distance creaked open with a piercing screech. Dread washed over her as Sarah realized She had no choice but to confront the terrifying truth lurking within Thornfield Hall. Thornfield Hall, outwardly a majestic mansion, dazzled with its towering walls and sprawling gardens that once captivated every passerby. However, few knew that it had witnessed a terrible tragedy. In the 19th century, the Archer family, the original owners of the estate, met a fate more horrifying than anyone could imagine. The story began in 1835 when Arthur Archer, a wealthy and influential merchant, purchased the vast land to build Thornfield Hall for his family. Arthur was a man of great influence in society at the time, and the mansion became a symbol of prosperity. Together with his wife, Elizabeth, and their 2 young children, the Archer family lived in luxury and wealth, becoming the center of attention in the town of Hazelwood. But behind the glittering facade lay dark secrets that the Archer family never wanted revealed. Arthur, obsessed with power and wealth, participated in an ancient secret ritual to safeguard his fortune. These mystical ceremonies, which he believed would bring him good fortune and protection, in truth, opened the door to a malevolent force that would soon infiltrate his family's life. Everything began to unravel on a winter night in 1835. The elegant dining room of Thornfield Hall was aglow with flickering candlelight. As usual, the Archer family gathered around a warm dinner. Laughter and conversation filled the air, creating what seemed to be the perfect scene. Little did anyone know it would be their last meal together. The next morning, Arthur didn't appear in town as he usually did. The household staff, growing concerned, knocked on the door but received no answer. Eventually, they decided to force the door open, and what they found left everyone speechless. In the dining room, the Archer family sat lifeless in their chairs, their eyes wide open in terror, their faces an eerie shade of purple. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Everything in the room was perfectly undisturbed, as if the Archer family had simply stopped living in an instant. The story of the mysterious death of the Archer family spread quickly throughout the town of Hazelwood, and soon enough, suspicions fell upon Mary Blackwell, the only surviving servant. Mary was a young, quiet, and reserved woman who had worked for the Archer family for years, yet no one knew much about her. When the Archer family died under such strange circumstances, all fingers pointed at Mary. People speculated that she had poisoned them out of some deep resentment. Mary was arrested and subjected to harsh interrogations, but she steadfastly maintained her innocence. She claimed that on the night the Archer family died, she had not been in the dining room with them. She also spoke of strange occurrences she had witnessed in the house before the tragedy, but no one believed her. To the people of Hazelwood, Mary's story was nothing more than a weak excuse. In the end, Mary was brought to trial, and despite the lack of solid evidence, she was sentenced to death. In her final moments before being hanged, Mary uttered a chilling curse. "I am innocent. You will never find peace. My spirit will haunt this place until the truth is revealed." A few days after Mary was executed, strange events began occurring at Thornfield Hall. The new servants hired to clean the house after the Archer family's death reported hearing footsteps echoing through the halls at night, even though no one was there. Windows would slam shut without any wind, and faint sighs could be heard coming from empty rooms. Some even claimed to have seen the shadow of a woman in a white dress, resembling Mary, wandering through the corridors of the house. These eerie occurrences spread throughout the town of Hazelwood, and Thornfield Hall was quickly labeled as a cursed house. Rumors circulated that Mary's spirit could never find peace and still roamed the mansion. seeking revenge on those who wrongfully condemned her. Locals began to avoid Thornfield Hall, and the once majestic estate became nothing more than a decaying, abandoned mansion, left to be reclaimed by nature. However, the supernatural occurrences at Thornfield were only just beginning. Anyone brave enough to step inside, even for a brief moment, could feel the presence of something that didn't belong to this world. Mary's spirit still lingered, and the curse she left behind would forever shroud Thornfield Hall until the truth about the Archer family's demise was uncovered. Thornfield Hall, once a symbol of prosperity, had transformed into a cursed place, where its bloodstained and tragic past could never be forgotten. Sarah Taylor woke up after a night filled with strange dreams, feeling heavy and uneasy. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that consumed her thoughts. The image of the woman in the white dress, with her hollow black eyes, kept resurfacing. Sarah tried to convince herself that it was just a hallucination, a trick of the old house, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong at Thornfield Hall. After washing her face and changing clothes, Sarah decided to meet with her group of friends to discuss what had happened the night before. They were sitting in the dimly lit living room, the light from the windows faintly piercing through the thick dust on the glass. Ethan, one of Sarah's friends, had gone missing the previous night, and no one knew where he had gone. This disappearance worried the group, especially with the strange phenomena that had begun to occur in the house. "Did anyone hear footsteps last night?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with tension. Jenna, who had been quiet the whole time, nodded. "I did. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I felt like someone was watching me." Mike, always the skeptic and confident in his disbelief of anything supernatural, tried to lighten the mood. "It's probably just the old house creaking in the wind, and Ethan's probably just wandering around somewhere. He'll show up by tomorrow." But Sarah couldn't shake the growing unease. She knew something had changed the moment they stepped into the house. It felt like the house was alive, as if it was watching them. "I don't think we're imagining things. I saw something last night. A woman. She was standing at the end of the hallway." Sarah's words heightened the tension in the room. Jenna glanced around quietly, as if she, too, felt something but was too afraid to admit it. Mike shook his head in disbelief. "Do you really believe in this ghost nonsense, Sarah? We're here to explore and gather material for your book. Don't let your imagination get the better of you." Sarah didn't respond. She knew Mike wouldn't believe, at least not until he saw something strange himself. Deciding not to argue, she refocused on the more pressing matter of finding Ethan. The group agreed to split up and search for Ethan, starting with the rooms on the upper floor, where Sarah had seen the woman the night before. As they climbed the creaky old staircase, each step echoed throughout the house. The air grew heavier the further they ventured inside, and an inexplicable sense of unease began to spread among them. Sarah, Jenna, and Mike checked each room, but they all stood empty. There was no trace of Ethan. Suddenly, Sarah stopped in front of a room with its door slightly ajar. She felt something strange about this particular space, not just the age of the house, but the presence of something invisible. "Should we go in?" Jenna asked, her voice low and filled with fear. Though still skeptical, Mike pushed the door open. As it swung fully, a cold gust of wind swept through, sending chills down their spines. This room was different from the others, seemed abandoned mid-use, with furniture covered in dust. But on the bed lay an old white dress, neatly placed as if someone had just worn it. Sarah glanced around the room, sensing a powerful presence. She felt as though someone was watching her, even though the room was completely empty. Suddenly, the window on the far side of the room screeched and flung itself open. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it faint, distant whispers that sent a wave of unease through them all. Sarah turned around, and the moment she glanced at the old mirror hanging on the wall, she saw something that made her gasp. In the reflection, a faint figure of the woman in the white dress stood behind her, those dark, sorrowful eyes full of grief and resentment. Sarah screamed, causing Mike and Jenna to spin around in shock. But when they looked into the mirror, there was nothing. The figure had vanished, leaving only Sarah, trembling, standing in front of the mirror. She was right there, Sarah said, breathless. The woman in the white dress. Jenna stepped closer, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder, trying to comfort her. Sarah, maybe you're just tired. This house is making us all tense. Sarah tried to calm herself, but deep down, she knew what she had seen was real. That woman, with her hollow eyes, wasn't just a hallucination. She was still here, wandering through the halls of this cursed house. The group continued their search for Ethan, but the deeper they ventured into the house, the more strange occurrences seemed to intensify. Footsteps echoed, whispers drifted from unseen corners, and even cold, chilling laughter echoed from the distance, amplifying their growing fear. Finally, when they decided to head back to the living room, Sarah paused by a wall filled with old portraits. She hadn't noticed them before, but now one particular portrait caught her attention. It was of a woman with long, flowing hair, dressed in a white gown. Her eyes, eerily lifelike, seemed to stare directly at Sarah. This is the woman I saw," Sarah said, pointing at the portrait. "That's her." Mike stepped closer to inspect the painting. Beneath it, he noticed a small inscription: Mary Blackwell, 1810 to 1835. The realization hit them immediately. This was the same Mary who had been executed at Thornfield Hall, accused of murdering the Archer family. A wave of fear washed over Sarah. Mary's spirit was still here, trapped in the mansion. And it seemed clear now she didn't want anyone uncovering the truth of what had happened all those years ago. Sarah Taylor and her friends returned to the living room, anxiety heavy in their hearts after discovering the eerie room and seeing the apparition of Mary Blackwell. Despite searching throughout Thornfield Hall, Ethan was still nowhere to be found. Tension within the group mounted, and the strange occurrences became more frequent and unsettling. Jenna, already the most timid of the group, had become frantic. She couldn't stop worrying about Ethan, constantly glancing out the window as if hoping for some miracle to save them from the increasingly terrifying situation. Meanwhile, Sarah was trying to maintain her composure, piecing together the clues they had uncovered. The image of Mary Blackwell, the portrait on the wall, and the unsettling sounds all pointed to something far more sinister than just an abandoned mansion. There was a deeper, horrifying truth hidden within Thornfield Hall. Mike, still skeptical about the supernatural, tried to distract himself by rummaging through the old books in the house's library. But things only got stranger when he discovered that many of the books were filled with strange symbols and drawings. These sketches hinted at ancient rituals, the very ones that Arthur Archer, the original owner of Thornfield, had allegedly participated in. The eerie realization began to settle over the group. They were dealing with something beyond their understanding. The pieces of history they'd stumbled upon suggested that the house's dark past was tied to more than just Mary's execution. It seemed linked to forbidden practices that had awakened something evil, something that still lingered, claiming new victims. As the group shared these grim discoveries, Jenna's voice trembled as she spoke. "We have to leave this place. Whatever happened here, it's still happening." Sarah nodded, but deep down, she knew they couldn't leave, not without Ethan. They were running out of time, and whatever force had taken hold of Thornfield Hall wasn't going to let them go easily. As Mike pulled a book from the shelf, an old notebook tumbled to the ground. He bent down to pick it up and noticed it was a weathered journal with messy handwriting. Inside, there were notes about secret rituals related to summoning dark forces to protect the Archer family's fortune. One entry referenced a ritual in 1835, the year the Archer family mysteriously died. Mike skimmed through it, his eyes widening with horror as he realized the Archer family had conducted a ritual seeking protection. But instead, they had inadvertently opened the door to something far more terrifying. The presence of Mary Blackwell in the house might not have been just her restless spirit, seeking justice. She too could have been a victim of the dark forces summoned by the ritual. "Sarah, you need to see this," Mike called out, handing her the journal. Sarah scanned the notes, her heart pounding as she read the details of the ritual. It seems like the ritual trapped Mary's soul here, and possibly others too. Jenna, overhearing this, became more frantic than ever. "We need to get out of here now," she screamed, her eyes wide with terror. "We shouldn't be here. Ethan might have already. No, I don't want to stay another minute." Sarah, holding the journal tightly, felt the weight of the discovery sinking in. The house wasn't just haunted by a vengeful spirit. Something far darker had been unleashed long ago. She knew they had to find Ethan, but with the growing dread and Jenna's panic, she feared their time was running out. ... Before anyone could react, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. The group froze as the sound of a door slamming reverberated through the house, the force of the impact shaking the very walls. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his voice edged with fear as he glanced toward the darkened hallway. "We have to check it out," Sarah said, though none of them felt brave enough to confront whatever was waiting beyond that door. After a tense pause, Mike, still trying to project courage, stepped forward and headed toward the source of the noise, with Sarah and Jenna reluctantly following behind. They walked down the long, dark corridor, the dim light from their oil lamps flickering weakly against the cracked walls. As they neared the large dining room door where the noise had come from, Sarah could feel the air grow heavier, thick with an ominous sense of dread. It was as though an invisible presence was watching their every move, its unseen eyes following them closely. The atmosphere became suffocating, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Whatever was behind that door was not something to be taken lightly. With each step, the tension grew, and all three of them knew they were on the brink of uncovering something they might not be ready for. When Mike pushed open the dining room door, what they saw made all three of them recoil in horror. The large dining table was in disarray, with plates and glassware shattered across the floor. The air inside the room had an unnatural chill, and lying motionless in the middle of the room was Ethan. The light from Mike's oil lamp illuminated Ethan's pale face, his eyes wide open and empty. Jenna screamed and rushed toward Ethan, but Sarah grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "No, don't touch him," Sarah warned, panic in her voice. Jenna sobbed uncontrollably, but obeyed, standing frozen, her entire body trembling. Mike knelt beside Ethan, checking for a pulse, but there was none. He's gone," Mike said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what happened, but he's not alive anymore." The group fell into a heavy silence. fear and dread tightening around them. Sarah scanned the room, desperately searching for any clues as to what had happened to Ethan. She couldn't believe this was just an accident. Something malevolent had hurt Ethan, and now she knew they were all in danger. At that moment, the dining room door slammed shut on its own, causing all three to jump in shock. Sarah turned around and saw a faint, ghostly figure moving across the room. It was the woman in the white dress, Mary Blackwell. She appeared slowly, her hollow black eyes locking onto Sarah, as if trying to communicate something. Sarah stepped back, trying to stay calm, but Mary's presence grew stronger. Her ghostly form seemed to be signaling a warning. "Mary, what do you want?" Sarah whispered, unsure if Mary's spirit could even hear her. But Mary didn't respond. She simply stood there, her eyes filled with sorrow and grief, before slowly fading into the air, leaving the group in stunned silence. The chilling realization settled in what had happened to Ethan was no accident. Sarah knew they were facing something far more powerful and dangerous than they had imagined. Thornfield Hall was no longer just an abandoned mansion. It was a residence for vengeful and malevolent spirits. And Ethan's death was only the beginning of the horrors that awaited them. Ethan's death cast a dark and oppressive silence over Thornfield Hall. But the rising tension and panic among Sarah, Jenna, and Mike left them no time to grieve. Sarah knew that if they didn't quickly unravel the terrifying mysteries surrounding the house, Ethan's fate wouldn't be the only tragedy. Deep down, she sensed that Ethan's death wasn't merely the result of Mary Blackwell's presence. It could be the work of something far more dangerous, something controlling the events within the house. After placing Ethan's body in a sealed room, the group gathered in the library to discuss their next steps and figure out a way to escape their current predicament. Fear hung thick in the air, but Sarah knew they couldn't just sit and wait for whatever force was stalking them to strike again. They needed to act. "We need to find out more about the Archer family's mysterious deaths," Sarah said, pacing in front of the dusty shelves, "and figure out what Mary's role in all of this is. I don't think she's the one harming us." Fear hung thick in the air, but Sarah knew they couldn't just sit and wait for whatever force was stalking them to strike again. They needed to act. "We need to find out more about the Archer family's mysterious deaths," Sarah said, pacing in front of the dusty shelves, "and figure out what Mary's role in all of this is. I don't think she's the one harming us." Jenna, still visibly shaken, sat quietly with her arms wrapped around herself. "But what if we're too late? Ethan's already gone. How do we stop something we don't even understand?" Mike, though still skeptical, seemed more willing to listen now. "There's something bigger going on here. That journal we found, it talked about rituals and dark forces. Whatever Arthur Archer and his family were involved in, it didn't end with them." Sarah nodded, determined. "We need to dig deeper into the Archer family's past. There has to be something more, something that connects all of this. If we can uncover the truth, maybe we can put an end to whatever's haunting this place." With renewed focus, they turned their attention to the library, combing through the old books and documents, searching for any clue that could explain the supernatural terror that had taken hold of Thornfield Hall. Sarah knew the answers were buried somewhere within these walls. If they didn't find them soon, they might not make it out alive. "I saw Mary," Sarah began, her eyes filled with determination. "She appeared right after Ethan passed. I don't think she wanted to hurt him. There was so much pain in her eyes. There's something we're missing, and if we don't figure it out, I'm afraid more people will be in danger." Jenna, trembling, curled up in the corner of the sofa, her face etched with despair. "We need to leave, right now. We can't fight this. Sarah, don't you see? Ethan's already gone, and we could be next." Sarah turned to Mike, who was intently rereading the journal they had found earlier. He looked confused, but still managed to hold on to some sense of reason. "You might be right, Sarah," Mike said. "In this journal, I read about a ritual Arthur Archer performed. It seems like he tried to use ancient magic to protect the family's wealth. But the ritual went wrong, and it looks like that's what opened the door to other forces, ones far more dangerous than just Mary." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as Mike mentioned the ritual. She realized that the Archer family's demise was tied to Arthur's dark practices. And it was those very rituals that had trapped Mary's spirit and likely others within Thornfield. "What kind of ritual are we talking about, Mike?" she asked, her voice low but tense. Mike flipped open the notebook, turning to the page with notes about the ritual. "This ritual is part of a rare occult practice Arthur found in ancient magical texts. The purpose was to summon a protective entity, a force to guard his family from any misfortune. However, there's a warning that says if the ritual is performed incorrectly, the entity would not only protect, but also become part of the house itself, manipulating anyone who resides within." Mike flipped open the notebook, turning to the page with notes about the ritual. "This ritual is part of a rare occult practice Arthur found in ancient magical texts. The purpose was to summon a protective entity, a force to guard his family from any misfortune. However, there's a warning that says if the ritual is performed incorrectly, the entity would not only protect, but also become part of the house itself, manipulating anyone who resides within. So, we're not just dealing with a ghost, but an evil entity?" Jenna asked, her wide eyes filled with fear. Mike nodded grimly. "Exactly. I'm not sure what this entity is, but it seems like it was awakened the moment we entered Thornfield. And I think it's what attacked Ethan." Sarah's heart raced as she pieced everything together. That explains why Mary seemed so trapped. Like she wasn't in control of what was happening. This entity, whatever it is, has been manipulating everything, and it's feeding off our presence. Jenna, trembling, looked at Sarah and Mike, desperation in her eyes. "But how do we stop it? If this entity controls the house, how can we even fight it?" Mike took a deep breath. "The only way is to reverse the ritual, to break the bond Arthur created. We need to find out how to close the door he opened, or else none of us will make it out alive." "What about Mary?" Sarah asked. "If this entity is the one that harmed Ethan, why does Mary's spirit keep appearing to us?" Mike thought for a moment before responding. "Mary might not be our enemy. She could be another victim of the ritual. When the Archer family performed the ritual, her soul could have been trapped here, and now she's trying to find a way to be freed. But the malevolent entity is stopping her. It wants to keep everything and everyone trapped within this house. Not just Mary's spirit, but us as well." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. Mary's spirit might hold the key to breaking the curse over Thornfield Hall, but the entity was working to keep that from happening. "If Mary's spirit is trapped here like the others," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency, "then we need to help her." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. Mary's spirit might hold the key to breaking the curse over Thornfield Hall, but the entity was working to keep that from happening. "If Mary's spirit is trapped here like the others," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency, "then we need to help her. I think she's trying to warn us, guide us, towards something that could free her and stop this entity. Jenna, still trembling, looked uncertain. But how do we do that? We barely know what we're dealing with. We need to dig deeper, Sarah said firmly. We need to figure out how to break the ritual and set Mary free. That might be the only way to stop this entity before it's too late for all of us. Mike nodded, determination starting to replace the fear in his eyes. Let's start by going through the journal more thoroughly. There has to be something in here that explains how to reverse the ritual. If we can find that, we might just have a chance. With that, the group huddled together, flipping through the old journal and any other documents they could find, knowing that their time was running out and the secrets buried within Thornfield Hall were the only things standing between them and survival. Mike placed the journal on the table and looked Sarah straight in the eyes. There's a way, but it's going to be dangerous. We need to perform a ritual to sever the bond between that entity and the house. But that means we'll have to confront it directly. Jenna jumped to her feet, her eyes wide with fear. Are you crazy? We can't do that. It's too dangerous. Sarah walked over to Jenna, gently placing a hand on her shoulder to calm her. Jenna, I know you're scared, so am I. But if we don't do this, we'll never get out of here. We have to do it for Ethan, and for ourselves. Do you trust me? Jenna looked at Sarah, tears streaming down her face. After a long pause, she gave a weak nod. I trust you, Sarah, but I'm so scared. Sarah pulled Jenna into a comforting hug, feeling the shared fear between them both. We'll do this together. We'll figure it out. Mike stood by, watching them with a sense of determination, knowing the real challenge lay ahead. They had no choice but to confront the dark force that had taken hold of Thornfield Hall and risk everything in the hopes of breaking free. Mike glanced at the journal once more and said, the ritual has to be performed at midnight at the center of the house. We'll need to gather a few things, but if we do it right, the entity will be banished and Mary can be freed. The group began their preparations, a mix of anxiety and fragile hope hanging in the air. They knew time was running out. The malevolent entity could strike at any moment, and they had no idea what awaited them once the ritual began. As night fell and darkness engulfed Thornfield Hall, Sarah felt the weight of the impending final battle. The house was no longer just a tomb. For dark secrets, it had become a battleground between life and death. And deep down, Sarah knew that not all of them would make it through the night. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its very walls vibrating with the presence of the entity they were about to face. Steeling herself, Sarah looked at Mike and Jenna. No matter what happens tonight, we do this together. We won't let it win. With the ritual hour approaching, they gathered everything they needed. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the true horror of Thornfield Hall began to unfold before their eyes. Darkness slowly enveloped Thornfield Hall, casting an even heavier, more oppressive atmosphere over the group. Sarah, Mike, and Jenna prepared for the ritual with tension thick in the air, their fear unspeakable. The flickering candles scattered around the large room barely held their light, swaying as invisible drafts seeped through the old, cracked doors. He worked with shaky hands, knowing they had only one shot to get this right. Jenna sat quietly beside Sarah, trembling, her grip on reality slipping. She was too terrified to speak, but the fear in her eyes said it all. Panic was overtaking her, threatening to break her resolve. Sarah, on the other hand, kept reminding herself why they were doing this. To break the curse and free Mary's soul. Yet the looming confrontation with a malevolent entity hiding within the house gnawed at her, making it hard to stay calm. Even with the candles still burning, the darkness of the house felt alive, as if it was breathing along with them, slowly swallowing every sliver of hope they had left. As the hour of the ritual approached, Sarah's heart raced, knowing that the true test of their courage and will was just beginning. As the clock struck midnight, Mike stood up, holding the old journal, and began chanting the incantation in a deep, urgent voice. The sound of the words echoed through the large room, blending with the distant whisper of the wind outside. Sarah and Jenna stood within the salt circle, their hands clasped tightly together, both feeling the air grow heavier and more oppressive with each passing second. Suddenly, the door to the large room flung open with a sharp, piercing creak. A cold gust of wind rushed in, snuffing out several candles, plunging parts of the room into darkness. Sarah shuddered, her eyes wide as she stared at the doorway, where the faint figure of a woman in a white dress slowly appeared. It was Mary Blackwell. Mary stood motionless at the threshold, her empty, sorrowful eyes fixed on Sarah's group. But this time, Sarah didn't feel the same fear as before. She knew now that Mary wasn't the enemy. Mary's spirit was a victim, trapped between worlds, unable to pass on because of Thornfield Hall's curse. With her heart pounding, Sarah stepped forward, breaking the silence. "Mary," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We're here to help you. We're going to break the curse." Mary's gaze remained locked on Sarah, her expression one of deep sorrow, as if pleading for release. The oppressive presence of the malevolent entity lingered in the air, but Sarah knew that if they completed the ritual, they might finally set Mary free and banish the darkness that had consumed Thornfield Hall. "Everything will be okay, Mary," Sarah whispered, trying to reassure not just Mary, but herself as well. However, as soon as Sarah took a step toward Mary, the entire room violently shook. The remaining candles were snuffed out in an instant, plunging them into complete darkness. From within the shadows, a monstrous growl echoed through the air. A bone-chilling wind swept over them, causing all three standing in the circle to shudder. There was no doubt the malevolent entity Arthur Archer had summoned centuries ago was now fully awakened. Mike quickly resumed chanting, his voice rising in desperation, but fear crept into his words. His chanting was met with a ferocious gust of wind that seemed to come from the very depths of the underworld, carrying with it horrifying screams that echoed from the darkness. The rooms shook violently, books and objects flung from the shelves, crashing to the floor. Above them, a massive shadow began to take form, looming larger and darker, filled with rage and malice. The entity had no distinct shape, only a swirling black mass that hovered in the air. But its burning red eyes pierced through the gloom, locking onto Sarah like the gaze of death itself. The sound of its heavy breathing and guttural growls reverberated throughout the room, making the walls tremble. Sarah felt a cold, sinking dread consume her as she stared into the entity's fiery eyes. She could sense its hatred, its desire to destroy everything in its path. For a brief moment, it felt like they were standing at the brink of oblivion, facing a force far more powerful than any of them could comprehend. But she knew they couldn't give up now. Gritting her teeth, Sarah turned to Mike. "Keep chanting. We have to finish the ritual, no matter what happens." "Keep chanting, Mike," Sarah screamed, her eyes locked on the monstrous entity creeping toward them. But just as she spoke, Mike abruptly stopped. The journal he had been reading from suddenly flew from his hands, hurled into the darkness. The malevolent entity had struck before they could finish the ritual. "Keep chanting, Mike," Sarah screamed, her eyes locked on the monstrous entity creeping toward them. But just as she spoke, Mike abruptly stopped. The journal he had been reading from suddenly flew from his hands, hurled into the darkness. The malevolent entity had struck before they could finish the ritual. "What do we do now?" Jenna cried out, her voice trembling with fear as tears welled in her eyes, watching the colossal shadow draw nearer. Sarah didn't have time to think, only to act. "We need to focus on this circle," she commanded. "It's the only barrier between us and that thing." The entity loomed closer, its shadow engulfing the room, swallowing every last bit of light and hope. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, suffocating them with its overwhelming presence. Behind them, Mary Blackwell stood silently, her gaze distant, as if even she couldn't resist the power of this entity. But Sarah sensed something more. Mary was waiting for something. "Mary!" Sarah shouted into the dark, her voice firm. "If there's anything you can do, now is the time. Help us finish what was started." The tension in the room was suffocating, the growls of the entity growing louder, more menacing. But Sarah felt a spark of hope deep inside her. Somehow, she knew that Mary was the key to defeating this ancient evil. They just needed to hold on a little longer. In that terrifying instant, Mike, panicking, accidentally stepped outside the protective circle. The malevolent entity wasted no time, extending its dark, twisted arms toward him. A blood-curdling scream filled the room as the entity grabbed Mike, pulling him into the suffocating blackness. Jenna screamed in despair, but it was too late. Mike was gone, vanished into the shadows, as though he had never existed. Sarah and Jenna stood frozen, their eyes wide with horror. The crushing weight of hopelessness threatened to overtake Sarah, but she couldn't afford to give in. "No!" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling with defiance. "I won't let it end like this." She turned to Mary, sensing that this was the moment that would decide everything. Mary remained still, her sorrowful eyes filled with both anguish and hatred. Sarah understood if they couldn't free Mary, the entity would never be defeated. "Mary!" Sarah cried out, her voice raw with desperation. "You don't have to suffer like this anymore. We can stop it, but we need your help. You have the power to end this." The room felt like it was closing in on them, but Sarah's plea hung in the air, a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness. She knew Mary was the key to stopping the curse, and without her, they were lost. This was their only chance. "Mary, help us," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with urgency as she tried to break through the invisible barrier separating them. "We know you're not our enemy. Help us destroy this entity, and we'll set you free." The monstrous shadow hissed in fury, its form thrashing violently as it sensed the impending confrontation. But Mary no longer feared it. She stepped closer to the entity, her light radiating more powerfully, pushing back the suffocating darkness. Sarah and Jenna stood still, watching with fragile hope as the light from Mary's form expanded, illuminating the room and forcing the entity to retreat. The oppressive blackness that had threatened to consume them began to waver under Mary's growing strength. The entity let out a final, agonizing shriek as Mary's light engulfed it, the darkness dissolving into nothingness. The room fell silent, and the tension that had gripped Thornfield Hall for so long began to lift. Sarah and Jenna stood there, breathless, watching as Mary's figure shimmered in the now peaceful glow. "You did it," Sarah whispered, her voice soft with a WE. Mary reached out her hand toward the entity, and the light from her palm grew blinding, enveloping the dark figure. A furious, agonizing scream filled the room as the entity was pushed back, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Piece by piece, the shadow began to dissolve, the darkness melting away under the force of Mary's radiant light. The room fell silent. The oppressive darkness was gone, leaving Mary standing there, the glow around her slowly fading. She turned to face Sarah and Jenna, her eyes no longer empty but filled with peace and release. She gave them a gentle nod, a final gesture of gratitude, and then, as softly as she had appeared, Mary faded into the air, leaving behind a complete and serene stillness. Sarah and Jenna stood frozen in place, their eyes wide, struggling to believe that it was truly over. Mary had freed herself, and in doing so, helped them defeat the malevolent entity that had haunted Thornfield Hall for so long. For the first time since entering the cursed house, they felt the weight lift from the era. Sense of peace finally settled over Thornfield Hall. It was over. The room fell into an eerie silence after the fierce confrontation with the malevolent entity. The faint light of dawn began to creep through the dusty windows of Thornfield Hall, casting soft rays over the chaotic remnants scattered across the grand room. Sarah and Jenna stood motionless, their minds numb with disbelief that they were still alive. They had lost Mike, and before him, Ethan. Everything now seemed hazy. But one thing was clear. Mary Blackwell had freed them from the dark force. Sarah slowly walked over to Jenna, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, trying to soothe them both. She could still feel the weight of fear pressing heavily on Jenna, and she herself couldn't fully shake the terror of what had just happened. But they knew one thing: their battle wasn't completely over. While the malevolent entity had been defeated, Thornfield Hall still held its secrets. "We need to uncover the final truth," Sarah whispered. Mary freed herself, but there are still hidden truths buried here. Jenna nodded slowly, her eyes still filled with the pain and loss of their friends, but there was also a flicker of determination. They had come too far to leave without understanding the full story behind the horrors of Thornfield Hall. And even though the dawn had broken, there were still shadows from the past waiting to be uncovered. Jenna looked at Sarah, her eyes still filled with fear, but there was a newfound resilience in her gaze that Sarah hadn't seen before. "I'm scared, Sarah, but I won't give up. We've come too far to turn back now." Both of them made the decision to return to the library, where Mike had discovered the ancient notebook containing Arthur Archer's dark ritual. Sarah believed there was more to the story than they had uncovered, and Thornfield Hall still harbored dark secrets about the Archer family's tragedy and their connection to Mary Blackwell. As they entered the library, the air remained cold and heavy, but the oppressive darkness that once loomed over them no longer had the same power. Sarah and Jenna began searching through old documents, books, and dusty records, hoping to find any clue that could explain the true reason behind the Archer family's downfall. Pages rustled, and the dim light of dawn filtered through the library's windows as they worked in silence. Every paper they touched, every old ledger they flipped through, held the potential to reveal the final, hidden truth about what had happened at Thornfield Hall and why so many lives, including Mary's, had been destroyed by it. As Sarah sifted through a pile of old letters, she paused. One particular letter, aged and fragile, caught her attention. The handwriting was different, almost frantic. It was addressed to Arthur Archer himself, warning him against continuing with the rituals. Sarah's heart raced as she began to read, sensing that they were close to uncovering the final piece of the mystery. Finally, Sarah found an old journal hidden deep in the drawer of an antique desk. The journal belonged to Arthur Archer, its leather cover decayed with time. She opened it, and the faded but clear handwriting of Arthur began to tell a dark story about the past of Thornfield Hall. In the early pages, Arthur Archer wrote about his family with great pride. He described lavish parties, meetings with high society, and the continuous growth of the Archer family fortune. But as Sarah turned to the later entries, Arthur's tone began to change. Worry and obsession crept into his words as he recounted unexpected financial troubles and the collapse of his family. Arthur believed that his family was cursed by an invisible force. In a desperate attempt to save his family's wealth and power, he turned to ancient magical texts. That's when he began performing mystical rituals, which led him to make a terrible choice, summoning an entity from another world to protect his fortune and his family. However, the ritual did not go as planned. The entity Arthur summoned was not a protector, but a demon, a terrible darkness that brought death and destruction. Instead of safeguarding the Archer family, the entity began demanding sacrifices, specifically the souls of his family. Sarah reached the final entries, her eyes widening as she uncovered the horrifying truth. Arthur had tried to break free from the malevolent entity's control by offering Mary Blackwell's soul as a sacrifice. Mary, the loyal servant of the family, had been used by Arthur as an offering, and she died unjustly, blamed for the murders of the Archer family. Sarah reached the final entries, her eyes widening as she uncovered the horrifying truth. Arthur had tried to break free from the malevolent entity's control by offering Mary Blackwell's soul as a sacrifice. Mary, the loyal servant of the family, had been used by Arthur as an offering, and she died unjustly, blamed for the murders of the Archer family. The curse she uttered before her death was not a random outburst, but the direct consequence of Arthur Archer's cruel actions. Mary wasn't just a victim, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She was sacrificed for a failed ritual. Her soul has been trapped here, bearing this injustice for hundreds of years. Jenna stood still, processing everything. So, the curse of Thornfield came from that ritual, and the Archer family was killed by the entity because they couldn't control it. Sarah nodded. Exactly. And when we came here, the entity was awakened again. But thanks to Mary, we freed her and stopped that entity for good. Jenna exhaled a sigh of relief, though the weight of losing Ethan and Mike still hung heavy in the air. They had survived, but the cost had been too high. Sarah stood up, her eyes filled with determination. We have to leave this place, and Mary Blackwell's story needs to be told. People need to know the truth about the Archer family and what really happened here. Jenna nodded in agreement. The horrors of Thornfield Hall had to be revealed so that no one else would suffer under its dark history. Together, they knew it was time to step out of the shadows of the cursed mansion and let the truth be known. Both of them left the library, walking through the now eerily quiet rooms. The ghost of Mary had vanished, and the atmosphere of Thornfield seemed lighter, as though the centuries-old haunting had finally been lifted. As they stepped outside, the dawn light bathed the old mansion, making it appear less menacing than before. Sarah turned back to look at Thornfield Hall one last time, feeling as though she had fulfilled a great mission, restoring justice to the wronged soul of Mary Blackwell. Sarah and Jenna left Thornfield Hall, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had endured and the losses they had suffered. The morning light illuminated the road ahead, but both still felt as though a dark cloud loomed over them. Though they had defeated the malevolent entity and freed Mary Blackwell's spirit, the deaths of Mike and Ethan left a deep scar in their hearts. They knew their lives would never be the same again. As they drove back to town, the car was filled with silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Sarah stared out of the window, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the past few days. She couldn't shake the images of Mary, Mike, and Ethan from her mind, especially the memory of Mike being pulled into the darkness and Ethan lying lifeless on the floor of Thornfield Hall. Those memories felt like deep, unerasable marks on her soul. The silence between them wasn't just from grief, but also from the realization that the world outside Thornfield Hall would never truly understand the horror they had faced. They had returned from the darkness, but the scars of their experience would stay with them forever. Jenna sat beside Sarah, trying to calm herself. She had faced the greatest fear of her life, but now a strange sense of relief was rising within her. At the very least, they had survived. Mary had been freed, and the malevolent entity was no longer a threat. But the cost had been too high, and the loss of Mike and Ethan prevented Jenna from feeling fully at peace. As the car neared the town, Sarah suddenly spoke. "We can't let this be forgotten, Jenna. Mary's story needs to be told." Jenna looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with sadness, but in agreement. "I know, but will anyone believe us? Who would believe a story about a haunted house and a wronged spirit?" Sarah was silent for a moment, reflecting on Jenna's words. She knew that telling their story wouldn't be easy. Most people would think they were making it up or being overly paranoid. But Sarah also understood that some truths needed to be exposed, regardless of whether others believed them or not. "I'll write everything down," Sarah decided, her eyes shining with determination. "I'll tell the story of everything that happened about Mary, the death of the Archer family, and what we went through. Not because I want fame or attention, but because I want the truth to be known. Mary doesn't deserve to be forgotten in the darkness." Jenna nodded. "I understand, and I'll help you. We can't let people like Ethan and Mike sacrifice in vain. The truth needs to be told, whether people believe it or not." As they returned to town, the two decided to stay at Sarah's house for the night, before returning to their normal lives. Sarah knew she needed time to process everything, and so did Jenna. They needed to face the reality that Mike and Ethan were gone, and they were the only ones who survived the confrontation with Thornfield Hall. That night, Sarah sat in her study, her eyes fixed on the blank sheet of paper in front of her. She realized that the story of Mary, Mike, and Ethan wasn't just a terrifying experience, it had been a journey that helped her understand herself and what truly mattered in life. As Sarah's pen touched the page, the words began to flow, each sentence pouring out like a stream. She recounted every detail, from their group's arrival at Thornfield Hall to the strange occurrences that started unfolding. And finally, the life-or-death battle when they confronted the malevolent entity. She wrote about Mary Blackwell, her tragic life, and the injustice she had endured. Sarah described how Mary became a victim of a dark ritual, bound to the house for centuries. Sarah left nothing out, not even the most painful moments: Ethan's death, Mike's sacrifice, and the fear that both she and Jenna faced. But she also wrote about their bravery, how they refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. And in the end, Sarah wrote about Mary's release, about how her spirit was finally freed after being imprisoned by evil for so many years. Each word was a testament to the strength they had shown, and the story of Mary, Ethan, and Mike became more than just a tale of horror. It was a story of courage, loss, and redemption. Jenna sat in the living room, waiting for Sarah to finish the draft. A sudden sense of peace washed over her, as if everything was finally settling after the nightmare they had endured. She knew their lives would never be the same, but at least they had survived and carried with them the story of those who were lost. When Sarah finally set her pen down, she let out a long, relieved sigh. She had completed her task, telling the truth. Now, it was up to fate how the story would be received. "It's done," Sarah said softly, stepping out of her study and sitting beside Jenna. "I've written everything." Jenna smiled gently. "I knew you'd do it." They sat in silence, with no more words needed. Their journey through Thornfield Hall had come to an end, but the memories and lessons from it would stay with them forever. Both understood that the road ahead would have its challenges, but they would face it together, just as they had braved the darkness of Thornfield. After finishing the manuscript about Thornfield Hall and the horrifying events they had experienced, Sarah and Jenna tried to return to their normal lives. However, the memories of the haunted house and the loss of Ethan and Mike lingered, refusing to leave them. The darkness of Thornfield still haunted their minds, like a wound that couldn't heal. Sarah sent her manuscript to a publisher. Though she wasn't certain how the story would be received, she knew she had done the right thing. Mary Blackwell's story and the truth about the Archer family needed to be made public, and Sarah hoped that by doing so, it would not only bring peace to Mary's spirit, but also help them find closure for the painful events they had endured. Several weeks had passed since they left Thornfield Hall. Sarah and Jenna tried to return to their daily routines, but both felt an undeniable change within themselves. Sarah frequently woke in the middle of the night, plagued by nightmares of darkness and strange, haunting sounds. She couldn't shake the image of Mike being pulled into the void, or the empty look in Ethan's eyes as he passed. One evening, while Sarah sat on her bed with her laptop, making final edits to the manuscript, she received a call from the publisher. They informed her that her story had been accepted and would be published. The news caught Sarah by surprise, but it also brought a sense of relief, as if things were slowly moving forward. She knew this was just the first step, but at least Mary's story would finally be told. Though the haunting memories remained, there was some comfort in knowing that the truth was about to reach the world, and perhaps it would bring peace to the souls still tied to Thornfield Hall. Jenna, though she had tried to stay calm, was still haunted by what had happened. She began experiencing nightmares, not only about Thornfield Hall, but also about Mary. In her dreams, Jenna found herself standing in the middle of the old house, face to face with the spirit of Mary Blackwell. She could feel Mary's pain and despair so vividly, as if Mary's soul had not been fully freed. Late one evening, Jenna called Sarah, her voice filled with worry. "Sarah, I don't think we've truly finished everything at Thornfield," she said, her voice trembling. "I keep dreaming about Mary. She doesn't say anything. She just looks at me, like there's still something left unresolved." Sarah sat in silence, thinking about what Jenna had said. She had experienced similar feelings, but had tried to push them aside, hoping that their story had ended when they left the house. But now, hearing Jenna's account, Sarah began to realize that perhaps the full truth had not yet been uncovered. There was still something lingering, a piece of the story that remained hidden, and it seemed that Mary's soul was trying to tell them there was more to be revealed. "Maybe we need to go back to Thornfield," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with doubt. "Maybe there's something we missed, something we didn't fully uncover." Jenna shuddered at the thought of returning to that place, but she knew Sarah was right. If Mary's spirit still wasn't fully freed, they might have to finish what they started. They decided they would return to Thornfield Hall once more, this time with the goal of searching for anything they might have overlooked. However, the fear of what might still be waiting for them in that haunted house weighed heavily on both their minds. The next day, Sarah and Jenna drove back to Thornfield, their hearts filled with anxiety, but also a strong sense of determination. When they arrived, the house still stood tall, silent, and ominous as it had before. Although there were no signs of the malevolent entity, the oppressive atmosphere around the house remained thick and suffocating. As they stood before the entrance, the sense of dread was undeniable. Yet they knew that this was a step they had to take if they were to finally lay everything to rest. "We have to find out what's been left behind," Sarah said, her eyes shining with determination. "We won't leave until we're certain that everything is over." They stepped into Thornfield Hall, their footsteps echoing through the quiet, empty space. The rooms, now barren, seemed to watch their return. There were no strange noises or sightings of Mary, but the unease still clung to them, palpable in the air. Both Sarah and Jenna began their search, combing through the house from top to bottom, checking places they might have missed before. After hours of searching, they stumbled upon a small, locked door hidden behind a bookshelf in the library, an area they hadn't noticed in their previous visits. It appeared to be a secret room. Together, they pushed the bookshelf aside, revealing the door. Sarah grasped the handle and gently turned it, opening the door to reveal a set of stairs leading down into a dark, dusty basement. The space below felt forgotten, untouched for years, as if it had been buried deep in the shadows of Thornfield's past. With a shared look of trepidation, Sarah and Jenna knew they were about to uncover something crucial, something that might explain why Mary still lingered and what had truly happened all those years ago. As they descended into the basement, the beam from Sarah's small flashlight illuminated a large room. On the walls, ancient drawings and symbols, similar to those they had seen in Arthur Archer's notebook, remained intact. But this time, in the center of the room, stood a large chest, locked tightly and covered in layers of dust. Jenna shuddered as she looked at Sarah. "What do you think is inside?" Sarah stared at the chest, feeling as though this could be the missing piece in Mary Blackwell's story. "There's only one way to find out," she said, her voice filled with determination. She knelt down and unlocked the chest, its lid creaking as it lifted open. Inside the chest was an old book, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah carefully picked it up and opened it. It was Arthur Archer's journal, the part they had never found before. This missing portion, hidden away in the secret basement, seemed to hold the final truths they had been searching for. In the final pages of the journal, Arthur confessed that he hadn't only sacrificed Mary Blackwell in the dark ritual, but had also sealed her soul within the very book they were holding. He feared that Mary's spirit would return to seek revenge, and he had sought a way to bind her forever to Thornfield. Sarah immediately realized that this was the reason why Mary had never been fully freed. Her soul was trapped within the book, and only by destroying it could Mary truly be released. "We have to burn it," Sarah said, her voice filled with resolve. Jenna agreed, and together they quickly found a way to set the book on fire. As the flames consumed the pages, a soft sigh of relief echoed through the room. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, as if the darkness had finally dissolved. Sarah and Jenna looked at each other, knowing they had completed their final task. Mary Blackwell had been set free, and now, at last, she could rest in peace forever. As the flames consumed the ancient book, Sarah and Jenna stood in silence, watching each yellowed page of Arthur Archer's journal burn to ashes, feeling as if the final pieces of the story were falling into place. The confessions in the book and the truth behind the dark ritual explained everything. This book had been the source of Mary Blackwell's centuries-long imprisonment, and by destroying it, they had finally freed her. The fire gradually died down, leaving a smoldering pile of ashes on the cold basement floor of Thornfield Hall. The atmosphere around them shifted, becoming unusually peaceful. Sarah and Jenna both felt a sense of relief, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. "We did it," Jenna said, her voice trembling, but her eyes gleamed with serenity. "Mary is finally free." They stood together, knowing that they had not only uncovered the truth, but had also granted Mary the peace she had been denied for so long. Thornfield Hall, once a place of darkness and despair, had at last let go of its haunted past. Sarah nodded, staring at the ashes before her. She knew that their long and arduous journey had finally come to an end, and they had succeeded. Though the cost had been high with the loss of Mike and Ethan, at least Mary Blackwell's soul had found peace. The haunting presence of Thornfield Hall no longer posed a threat. Both of them climbed out of the dark basement, retracing their steps up the old, creaky stairs to the main floor. Thornfield Hall, once a place shrouded in darkness and tragedy, was now nothing more than an empty, abandoned house. Here were no more footsteps, no eerie whispers, no chilling presence. The house had been freed from the centuries-old curse. As they stepped through the main doorway to leave, Sarah and Jenna paused for a moment, turning back to look at Thornfield Hall one last time. They had survived. They had faced their fears and the supernatural forces that had haunted the place. And in the end, they had triumphed. Yet, in both of their eyes, there remained a sense of sorrow for the friends they had lost along the way. The house, now silent and still, no longer held the weight of its dark history. But for Sarah and Jenna, the memories of what they had endured and the sacrifices made would stay with them forever. Sarah gently touched the worn-out doorknob, silently whispering a final goodbye to Mary in the ancient house. She felt a soft breeze pass by, carrying with it the breath of the past, but now it brought peace instead of darkness. "We did everything we could," Jenna said, her eyes glistening with tears but filled with a sense of calm. Sarah nodded. "Yes, it's over now." They stepped outside, the morning sunlight streaming over the overgrown garden of Thornfield Hall. The house stood still, no longer shrouded in menace. It was just an old building now, holding memories of a bygone era. As they walked down the path leading away from the property, Sarah felt a lightness in her steps. The farther they moved from the house, the more she could feel peace settling within her, as if all the shadows, sorrow, and loss had been buried in the past. Thornfield Hall was behind them, and ahead was the chance for healing and new beginnings. A few weeks after returning, Sarah received the news that her book had been published. The story of Mary Blackwell and the truth behind the tragedy of the Archer family was now widely shared. The book wasn't just a horror story, it was a journey of seeking truth, of freeing a trapped soul, and of how those who survived faced their deepest fears. Sarah's story garnered significant attention from readers. Some believed it was purely fictional, while others were convinced of the existence of the supernatural and the haunting curse. However, what people thought didn't matter much to Sarah. She knew that she had fulfilled her mission telling the truth about Mary Blackwell, Thornfield Hall, and everything they had endured. For Sarah, It was never about gaining fame or recognition. It was about justice for Mary and finding closure for herself, Jenna, and those they had lost. In sharing their story, Sarah had brought light to the darkness that had once consumed Thornfield Hall. And that was all that mattered. Jenna gradually found balance in her life again. She returned to work and tried to move forward, carrying the valuable lessons from that painful experience. Although she could never forget what had happened, she found solace in knowing that they had done everything they could to free Mary's soul. One day, Sarah and Jenna met at their usual cafe, chatting about their current lives. Though life had mostly returned to normal, Thornfield Hall, their lost friends, and Mary was still subjects they occasionally revisited. "Do you still think about Mary?" Jenna asked, her eyes thoughtful. Sarah sipped her coffee and nodded slowly. "I do, not as often as before, but sometimes I wonder if she's truly at peace now. It feels like a part of her will always stay with us." Jenna smiled softly. "I think so too. In a way, she helped us as much as we helped her. What we went through, it changed us." Sarah agreed, knowing that while they had faced unimaginable horrors, they had emerged stronger and more resilient. The memories of Thornfield Hall would never fully fade, but they both knew they had found closure, not just for Mary, but for themselves as well. Sarah stayed silent for a moment, then smiled. "Yes, but it's no longer an obsession. I think of her with respect and compassion. She endured so much, but in the end, she was freed." Jenna nodded, feeling a sense of relief settle within her. "I feel the same. I'm not afraid anymore. We made it through." Their conversation continued, but the ghosts of the past no longer haunted them. Sarah and Jenna had emerged from the shadows of Thornfield Hall, and now they could move forward, free from fear. With the weight of the past behind them, they both knew that while they would never forget what they had faced, they had reclaimed their lives. Thornfield Hall was just a memory now, one that had shaped them, but no longer held them captive. They had found peace,